I'm very happy, and I can't say I'm surprised, but I think we're all very, very happy to see this result.
Orbán is not Hungary and not the Hungarian people. So take this election as a message from the Hungarians.
For Hungary, it means definitely we're going to stay in the European Union.
As a Hungarian woman, it's absolutely important for me because I have a brother and my niece lives here, and I want my niece to grow up in a country that I was happy to grow up when I was young. We can be free again, and it's great.
These were the voices of young Hungarian citizens whom Euronews spoke with on the riverbanks of the Danube in Budapest, where the Tisza party was holding its parliamentary election victory celebrations on Sunday night. I was on the ground approaching voters just after former Prime Minister Viktor Orbán conceded defeat. As you can hear, they were enthusiastic about what was beginning to look like a historic victory for the Conservative Party led by Péter Magyar. Moments later, in fact, Tisza secured a two-thirds majority, ending far-right Viktor Orbán's 16 years in power. Here's Magyar talking to his supporters and celebrating the outcome of one of the world's most awaited and most watched elections of 2026.
A Tisza és Magyarország megnyerte ezt a választást.
Tisza and Hungary have won this election.
Nem kicsit, hanem nagyon. Sőt, nagyon-nagyon.
We won not small, but big, very, very big.
Közösen leváltottuk.
Together, we changed the Orbán regime. Together, we liberated Hungary. We took our homeland back.
Hello and welcome to Brussels, My Love, the podcast, Euronews' weekly show on European and EU politics. I'm Lauren Walker and I'll be your host for the day. On this Friday, the 17th of April, we take a moment to look back at the main political event of the week, the Hungarian parliamentary elections. Nearly 80% of eligible voters cast their ballots on the 12th of April to elect the 199 members of the National Assembly. This was the highest turnout ever recorded in a Hungarian election. The vote was closely watched by the EU and international players. The outgoing Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has, in fact, been a central actor here in Brussels, where he's well known for his anti-EU rhetoric and his use of the veto mechanisms to block, among others, aid to Ukraine. On the contrary, Magyar, the incoming Prime Minister, has taken a more positive stance on the EU and pledged to repair relations between Budapest and Brussels. He has also vowed to unblock the 90 billion euros loan for Ukraine that was blocked by Orbán. But will he be able to break with Orbán's legacy? To find out the answer to this question, I'll talk to Euronews' EU reporter Sándor Zsíros, who you might remember from a previous episode in which he analysed the Hungarian electoral campaign and introduced its candidates. But before that, we have a short interview ready for you. Charles Michel, former Prime Minister of Belgium and former President of the European Council, sat down with my colleague Maeve McMahon earlier this week. They discussed the end of Orbán's chapter, its repercussions in Brussels, and the United States' political interference in the Hungarian campaign. Let's have a listen.
Charles Michel, thank you so much for joining us on Brussels, My Love, the podcast. Of course, we're looking at the Hungarian elections. What was your initial reaction to the outcome?
My first impression is, of course, that's an important moment for the EU, but that's also an important moment for the future of Hungary. And I'm confident that with this decision made by the Hungarian voters, it will allow the EU very rapidly, I hope, to be more ambitious in terms of European solidarity, in terms of European integration, and in terms of support for Ukraine.
How did you react when you were back home on Sunday night?
To be honest, I was also happy and pleased because it was also an indication that the Hungarian voters are not intimidated or impressed by the attempt of interferences. We've seen how the United States, especially the White House, J.D. Vance, the President of the United States himself, they have done a lot to support Viktor Orbán and, in fact, to support an attempt to destabilize the future of the EU. That's not what we do when we are sincere allies, and I think we need to be lucid in Europe. And I do not blame the United States. That's the choice of the United States, but we have to make our own choices. In my opinion, we have to act in order to be more sovereign.
Bring us inside those EU summits. When you were sitting around the table with him, there were so many of them, and he was so uncooperative all the time.
Not all the time. I would like to be more moderated in my assessment. But on some topics, indeed, it was very difficult to get a united position, especially in foreign affairs, especially when it comes to Ukraine and the need for us to support Ukraine through the enlargement process, through some macro-financial support, or also through the need to support Ukraine from a more geopolitical point of view.
And tell me, were you surprised by the outcome?
No, I was a bit surprised by the results, even if the polls were indicating the days before, even the weeks before, that the trend was not in favor of Viktor Orbán. But it's true that after 16 years in power, there is this impression that Viktor Orbán is Hungary and that Hungary is Viktor Orbán. It was a mistake, and the voters made their choice.
And was it a mistake for the Americans to send J.D. Vance? Because that obviously didn't work. People they weren't attracted to this appeal, this MAGA effect.
We'll never know if J.D. Vance had not participated in these meetings in Hungary, what had been the result. But one thing is absolutely clear. Political interferences, it does not work systematically. Sometimes it can work. But can you imagine if in one European country during an electoral campaign, President Xi would call to express a support? That's something we cannot imagine. And I think that we cannot accept that the future of the EU is decided elsewhere than within the EU.
And was it a nail in the coffin, perhaps, for the Fidesz party as well, that the allegations came out that they were leaking information to the Russians from EU summits, in fact?
I think it's needed to make sure that there will be investigation, that transparency will be made, because everyone has to be accountable. And if you make decisions and you act in a certain way, there must be some consequences.
So when it comes to policy now, what could change with this new era in Hungary? First, when you mentioned Ukraine, so could we see now that loan being leashed?
Yeah, I think that now there is no reason anymore to wait, and I hope that the EU institutions will act very, very fast, because we know that in Ukraine they need this financial support to help them to be in a better and in a stronger position. I know that those talks with the United States, with Ukraine, with Russia, and without, unfortunately, the EU are extremely difficult. I'm doubtful that those talks will lead very soon to something tangible in terms of a peace agreement, but it means that we have to support Ukraine, because I repeat again that our support for Ukraine is our support for our common future.
And Péter Magyar said he will travel to Warsaw, then Vienna, and then Brussels. And he said he'll come to Brussels to get the money back. Will he?
I hope that he will do what is needed to get the money back. And it means that after the elections, it's important to implement the promises, and it's important to deliver on its engagements. And if he acts that way, I suppose that there will be no reason not to give back the financing to Hungary.
And just finally, we saw on the billboards during this campaign images of President Zelensky and images of Ursula von der Leyen. If you were still in office in the council and you had seen your image up there on those billboards, how would you have felt?
Look, this is the electoral campaign, and I feel it's important to look at the future. And today there is a new situation. There is a new chapter for Hungary, a new chapter for the EU. But I know that today we are all, or many of them at least, we are happy. We have the impression it will be easier. I would like us to be reasonable and to be serious. It does not mean that everything will be easy in the months to come. If I look at the single market, if I look at European defense, if I look at the capital market, I don't think that Orbán was the main reason for us not to deliver on those important challenges.
And just maybe one final anecdote or encounter you remember between you and Viktor Orbán during your years in the council?
No, there are a lot of anecdotes, but I remember, for instance, a few years ago when we were facing these difficult migration challenges, that we had very hard disputes, himself and myself. But after that, we managed to improve our personal relationship, to make it more professional, and to make sure that in my previous capacity, I was in a position to do everything to get as much as possible Hungary on board.
So do you have his mobile number? Will you call him to say, too bad?
I have his mobile number, but I never comment my personal contacts with leaders or former leaders.
Okay. But meanwhile, of course, a lot of European leaders have been posting selfies of themselves calling Péter Magyar to congratulate him.
Yeah, and I congratulate him for this victory because it is opening a new chapter in Hungary.
Charles Michel, thank you so much for being on our podcast.
Thank you for your invitation.
This was former European Council President Charles Michel, interviewed by Euronews' very own journalist and presenter, Maeve McMahon. But now it's time for us to turn our attention to Sándor Zsíros. Hi, Sándor.
Hi, Lauren. Thanks for the invitation.
Not at all. Thank you for coming. How are you doing? And have you recovered from the very busy weekend that you had covering the elections in your country?
I'm actually doing good. I'm a little bit tired because I'm working pretty tough hours. But I mean, it's a very interesting period. And as a journalist, doing all of these stories that are coming out of Hungary, it's a great thing. And we have a lot of clicks also. So a lot of people are interested. And it's an extremely interesting period for me.
And Sándor, I'd like to look at a post that you published earlier this week on LinkedIn to mark actually your 13th work anniversary at Euronews, for which also congratulations. You wrote, and I quote, "When I joined in 2013, I never imagined that Hungary-EU relations would become so turbulent, or that being a Hungarian journalist in Brussels would be so demanding and so satisfying." It's a big question, I know, but could you explain briefly what has changed in EU-Hungary relations since 2013, and how has your role as a journalist evolved over that time, maybe in line with this evolution?
Yes, so when I came to Brussels 13 years ago in 2013, the relations were already, deteriorating. There were a few issues that have been debated, like gay rights and media freedom, but overall, the relations were okay. But after the beginning of the end of the decade, it has become extremely bad. And there was a lot of debates, a lot of stress, a lot of, arguments around Hungary, to that point that, eventually the European Union suspended most of the funds for Hungary. They started the Article 7 process against Hungary. And suddenly Hungary became an epicenter of a huge fight inside the European Union, which I never ever imagined. And also many people were questioning actually the place of Hungary inside the European Union, which was really a huge surprise for me. And yes, things just escalated further until that last year, and this electoral campaign was a complete misery for the whole European Union, because, Hungary has become a sort of ideological battleground for Europe between the hard right, far right people and between the mainstream of Europe.
And now, of course, Péter Magyar's victory on the 12th of April has been welcomed by many, including in Europe, as a new chapter for Hungary. But will this result be enough to change the political system built by Orbán in Hungary over his past 16 years in power? Obviously, we've heard that he controls quite a lot of the various aspects of the state. Does Magyar already have a plan for how to change this?
Well, I think Magyar is definitely on the way to destroy Orbán's system. The first steps we see already. He wants to shut down public media. He wants to get rid of the president. He wants to get rid of the tax office head and other leaders and to replace them. And he also wants to shut down completely Orbán's propaganda and media machine, which is huge. And then we will see which direction he goes. He has also 2/3 majority like Orbán had, so he can rewrite the constitution. He can change the whole political system in Hungary according to his own wish. And, there are fears, of course. He's coming from Orbán's party, so ideologically, he's very close. When you see, the real right-wing conservative values that he has.
But of course, they were in the same party.
They were in the same party, exactly. So there are these thinking that, okay, this will replace Orbán with somebody who is really similar mindset. But eventually, his last 2 years, the whole campaign was about, let's bring change to Hungary, let's bring Hungary back to Europe, let's give back the democracy to the people, and let's shut down corruption, he cannot turn back, simply because the vast majority of the people voted for this. The agenda is very, very clear. And if he ever wants to compromise on this or wants to have another political idea, then it's in a way a political suicide, because the big majority, 3.3 million voters, voted for a change. And in my view, he cannot backtrack on that.
And you're talking about that promise to bring Hungary closer to the EU, and that's definitely something I heard among Tisza voters as well on the streets, that they were saying this is proof we want to be closer to the EU, not to Russia. But what about the EU? Will Magyar's victory truly change Hungary's role in the EU? And what does he plan to do in Brussels? He was, of course, also MEP in Brussels.
So for the EU, everything is better in Hungary than Orbán, because Orbán was the worst. He was just vetoing things because he could, and he, negotiated very badly, and the Russian ties and the foreign minister's Russian ties caused a lot of problems for Brussels. Now, Magyar had a pro-European campaign, and he already announced a couple of things which are really, in a way, pro-European for Hungary. So, for example, he wants to introduce the euro, he wants to join European public prosecutors, he wants to bring back European cash, and he promises to be, a sort of realistic partner, a constructive partner for Europe. But I don't expect a lot of, enthusiasm when it comes to, for example, Ukraine or migration, because he said, for example, that he doesn't want to fast-track Ukraine's accession, he doesn't want to send Hungarian money to Ukraine, and he doesn't want to approve the so-called migration pact and, the distribution of migrants inside the European Union. So I expect him to be constructive and at the same time a very hard negotiator when it comes to his interest. But he said very clearly that he doesn't want to fight just to have a fight and to have it on the billboards in Hungary. So he doesn't want, in a way, to misuse the relationship with Brussels to have political gains.
And how has his victory modified Orbán's network and influence in the European capital? I know that you this week wrote an article on this topic exactly.
Yes, that's a very interesting point to discuss, because, Orbán's agenda was that together with Patriots Europe, they have to take over Brussels, they have to occupy it and turn it into a sort of, very right-wing, very populistic European Union. Now, this will be in a way hindered or blocked, because simply Hungary will not finance this network anymore. So we are talking about plenty of institutions. We have MCC Brussels, which is a think tank related to MCC Hungary, and it's largely financed by shares of Hungarian companies. And Magyar thought that, okay, we have to take this money back. So that's number one. Definitely the EU ambassador of Hungary will be removed, and there is a big question mark around Hungarian EU Commissioner Olivér Várhelyi, who was appointed by Viktor Orbán, but his fate is not decided yet.
And lastly, to close, let's suppose you spend another 13 years at Euronews, continuing your work as a reporter and covering Hungary. What do you hope to write in your next LinkedIn post?
My idea would be to have a very boring country, something like Luxembourg, not a lot of problems, but good vibes, and not to write a lot of stories about tensions, but, let's write a lot of stories about how good the life is in Hungary and how well the cooperation is with the European Union. Honestly, sometimes I was very, very tired and very stressed about all the negative content and the blockade of what was coming out of Hungary. So what I wish for myself and maybe also for the Hungary-EU relations is to, have a little bit of chill.
Thank you so much, Shander, for this talk. That was so interesting. That's all for today's episode of Brussels, My Love, the podcast. Thanks to former European Council President Charles Michel and to Euronews' EU correspondent Shander Giroche for joining us on the show. And thank you all for listening. This show was created by Maeve McMahon. This episode was written and produced by Alice Carnavali and presented by me, Lauren Walker. Thank you also to those behind the scenes here at Euronews. Our sound technician, Yorgos Livadidis, and our social media aide, Rebecca Spezzano. If you aren't already, you can listen to this series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on euronews.com or on Euronews' YouTube channel. And if you like what you hear, subscribe to Brussels, My Love, the podcast, leave us a review, give us a rating, and of course, spread the word about Brussels, My Love, the podcast. See you next time.
Euronews.